Good morning. I'm Father Stephen Evans from St. Andrew's Anglican Church here in Syracuse, and I am your guest lecturer today for Mrs. O'Malley's 10th grade religion class. I want to thank Mrs. O'Malley for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. I also want to thank my son Nick Evans. Many of you know Nick. He's a 10th grader at CBA. Thank him for getting me involved in this. I want to give a special shout out to some of the 10th grade students that come around that might be watching this today. Logan and Zach, Megan, Emma, Kate, Carrie, and Samuel, no more Mr. Nice Keener. You kids are great. You're always welcome at my house, even during a pandemic. Come on over. Today I'm going to be talking to you about Luke chapter 15. Chapter 15 in the Gospel of Luke is my very favorite passage in the entirety of the Bible. I love it for a lot of reasons. I love it for those times that I felt lost in my life. I love it for those times where I felt unwanted or unloved. I love it for those times where I've messed up and people have judged me without knowing me or without being compassionate. And I love this passage because it so clearly shows God's compassionate heart. He is so merciful. He is so loving. And Jesus just drills that home today in Luke 15. There's a key to understanding Luke 15. Something that we're going to talk about today that you just simply must know to get the full impact of this passage. You have to know the audience. Who is it that Jesus is talking to in this passage? Firstly, I believe that brings out the impact. And then secondly, when you look at the fact that there are three parables that Jesus is teaching, it's as if the first two are setting up the crescendo of the last one. The parable of the lost sheep, then the lost coin, and then the parable of the prodigal son, as it is often called. Depends on your perspective. Once you have children, you'll understand this parable to be the parable of the waiting father. Let's talk briefly for just a moment about what a parable is. I want to give you a working definition of a parable. Now, Mrs. O'Malley might have a different definition for a parable than I have. You need to pay attention and memorize her definition. My definition is just for us to get through this lesson today. The definition of a parable that I learned in seminary is a story that makes a comparison. A story that makes a comparison. Parables can be historical or fictional. It doesn't really matter, but they are used to compare things. And oftentimes they are used to teach moral or religious concepts. So in this parable, Jesus uses the simple comparison of comparing things on earth with things in heaven. Things in the material realm with things in the unseen spiritual realm. A parable is a story that makes a comparison. In Luke 15, Jesus teaches three parables to communicate truth about God, about who He is, about what His character is like. And He does this in an attempt to dispel the lies and the fake news that the Pharisees and the scribes have been teaching the people. Yes, God has a problem with fake news, just like some other people we know. Now, let's begin by looking at the audience. Who is it that Jesus is talking to? And we're going to begin by looking at the first two verses in chapter 15 of Luke. Verse 1 and 2. It says, "The tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to listen to him. But the Pharisees and scribes began to complain, saying, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" So, who is listed here? There are two groups that Jesus is talking to, and in those two groups there are two subgroups, right? So the first one that is mentioned are the sinners and the tax collectors. The second group that happens to be there, I think this group is Jesus' main audience, the sinners and the tax collectors. But these other dudes show up, the Pharisees and the scribes. Scribes are also sometimes called teachers of the law. They show up also, and they're the kinds of guys who are standing there with their hands on their hips, kind of sneering at Jesus. We'll talk a little bit more about them. Let's talk about sinners and tax collectors for a moment. Who were these sinners? Firstly, they were Jewish, and they broke some part of the Mosaic Law. They broke one of the 613 commandments. Now, you understand, we're all sinners. I'm a sinner, you're a sinner, everybody you know is a sinner, right? The Bible says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." The Bible makes explicitly clear that every single human, except for Jesus, sinned against God. However, these sinners are not just that. These sinners sinned in some public way so that everybody knows about it. So, for example, I have a relative who was arrested for doing something harmful to children, and his name was all in the newspaper. I have another relative who got a DWI, drove through a stop sign and into a house. Name was all over the newspaper. They sinned. The whole community knew about it. That's the type of sinners that Jesus is talking about here. Sinners where they did something, and it doesn't say what here. It doesn't say specifically what they did. Could have been a host of different things, but everybody knew about it. Perhaps they committed adultery or some other sexual sin, and they were found out and caught. Perhaps they stole something. Perhaps they did not keep some part of the ceremonial or religious law. Whatever it was, these were public sinners. They were Jewish. They were public sinners. Thirdly, what else do we know about them according to this passage? They sought after God. They were interested in what Jesus had to say. It says here that the sinners were all drawing near to listen to him. Jesus, you ought to understand, has rock star status at this point, right? He's like Kanye or somebody like that, who if he showed up in the neighborhood, everybody comes out to see him, right? And that's the case with Jesus. When Jesus shows up in the neighborhood, everybody comes out to see him. But these sinners, they were particularly interested in what Jesus had to say. They were interested in spiritual matters. They were interested in God. Secondly, or third, I guess this is fourth. Fourth thing that we know about them, they were welcomed by Jesus. And that's really what the Pharisees and the scribes make their complaint about Jesus. They say, this man welcomes sinners. The other group that is oftentimes mentioned, we see them mentioned elsewhere in the scriptures, sinners and tax collectors. Apparently they all hung out together. The reason that they all hung out together is that they were alienated by the whole rest of the community. There was a wedding in the community. Nobody invited the sinners and tax collectors. There was a religious feast or a festival of some sort, teaching at the synagogue. Nobody invited the sinners and tax collectors. There was a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. Nobody invited the sinners or tax collectors. These people were ostracized from the rest of the community. So much so that we know from other ancient writings that when Pharisees or scribes were walking down the sidewalk on the street and the sinners and tax collectors came at them, the Pharisees and the scribes literally went to the opposite side of the street to walk around them and made a big show of it. Sinners and the tax collectors. People hated the IRS then just as much as they hate the IRS now. But the IRS worked a little bit different in the Roman Empire. It's getting to that point here, right? We're almost, today's March 30th. We're 2 weeks away from having to turn in our tax forms, right? I got to send my form in with a check paying my taxes, right? It didn't work that way in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire sent out tax collectors, and they went person to person. They went household to household. And the way that tax collectors made money was that, say you owed 5 denarii to the Roman Empire, well, the tax collectors would charge you 8. They'd keep 3 for themselves, and then they would pay actually what was known as an arch tax collector, kind of like a tax collector supervisor. And then that tax collector supervisor, he said, oh, I see you collected 5 denarii from this guy. Well, you've got to pay me 1 or 2. So the local tax collectors always gouged enough out of the average person to have enough for themselves and to pay the Roman Empire and to pay the archdeacon or the arch tax collector over his head, pay him as well. However, one more important point to know about these tax collectors. These tax collectors were Jewish. You have to remember that the Jewish people of this time are living within the borders of ancient Israel, but Israel is owned and dominated by the Roman Empire. And the Jewish people despised it. They hated it. The Jewish people, they knew the scriptures. They knew that this land was meant to be the promised land. This land was meant to be their inheritance from God. This land was to be the land flowing with milk and honey, and it was for them. They knew it was their inheritance. And for them to be subjugated and to be servants and slaves inside the Roman Empire, they hated this. And so any Jewish person who would be a tax collector collecting money for the evil Roman Empire, these people were looked at as traitors. They were looked at as treasonous, as turncoats. So the sinners and the tax collectors were often together, alienated from the rest of the community. But it says here, they were interested in hearing what Jesus had to say. Now, who else was in the crowd? The Pharisees and the teachers of the law, or the scribes. The text says that they were complaining about Jesus. Other translations use this word. I like this better. It says that the Pharisees and the scribes were muttering. Do you know what it means to mutter? When you're muttering, kind of talking under your breath, right? So these Pharisees and these scribes, arms folded, head tilted to the side, looking at him, and they're looking at Jesus, and they're looking at these people, and they're looking at him in utter contempt. Do you know what the word contempt means? Look it up. Contempt. C-O-N-T-E-M-P-T. Contempt. They're looking at him and they're muttering and complaining, saying, I can't believe this guy, this rabbi Jesus. Look at him. He's eating with sinners and tax collectors. He welcomes them. What do we know about the Pharisees, and what do we know about the scribes? Let me give you just a few things about the Pharisees. The Pharisees were an influential first century sect of Judaism. These Pharisees were teachers and were synagogue leaders. They were very pious. They rigorously followed the Mosaic law and all the oral interpretations that went along with it. In the Gospels, the Pharisees are oftentimes presented as hypocritical, proud opponents of Jesus. And in fact, Jesus says this in Matthew 23 about Pharisees. He states it bluntly. He says, they do not practice what they preach. And then we have the scribes, or the teachers of the law. The scribes were educated Jewish religious leaders whose job it was to know and to copy the Hebrew Bible. They were interpreters of the Mosaic Law. And they too, like the Pharisees, are oftentimes depicted in the Gospels as being hypocritical and being in conflict with Jesus. They became professionals at spelling out the letter of the law while ignoring the spirit behind it. Towards the end of Jesus' ministry, he thoroughly condemns the scribes for their hypocrisy. They knew the law, they taught it to others, but they did not obey it themselves. So that's who was there: sinners and the tax collectors, the scribes and the Pharisees. One more important thing to note about them: when the Pharisees and the scribes are complaining about Jesus and they say that he welcomes them and he eats with them, the part about eating with them is really significant, because who you ate with was a declaration of solidarity and friendship with. These self-righteous religious leaders said Jesus welcomes sinners, which is something that they would never do, and they couldn't believe it. Now, Jesus sees this whole dynamic playing out. He knows what's in the hearts of the sinners and the tax collectors. He knows how unloved they feel, how left out and alienated they feel. He knows that in their hearts they probably feel that even God doesn't want them. And he knows that they feel this way because the scribes and the Pharisees have misrepresented God to them. Fake news. And so Jesus wants to fix this. And so he attempts to drill home a point with these three parables about who God really is, about what God's heart is really like. I was reminded of a song that's on K-Love. I don't know if any of you listen to K-Love. It's a song by King and Country. It goes, God only knows what you've been through. God only knows what they say about you. God only knows that it's killing you. But there's a kind of love that God only knows. Jesus wants to teach about that love today.